And so a recent survey was taken, and it showed that the top 2 reasons for why executives execute fraud are the pressure to meet goals and personal gain. I'm a little surprised at the personal gain, but because I do see oftentimes where budgets are implemented or commitments are made to the market, and then circumstances happen beyond the organization's influence, and just negatively impacts their ability to meet goals. And because of this pressure, and because of stock analyst pressures, and what is reported on the street about an organization's stock, I can understand the pressure to meet goals. The personal gain, I guess, is a part of everyone, and it's kind of a personal decision people have to make about how they're going to conduct themselves in the business world. And so this is a cute little mnemonic brought up by the book that if you're talking about fraud and what it means, you think about, what will I tell my mom, MON, which really reflects the motive, opportunity, and means. And for fraud to occur, each of these items must be present. If there's opportunity and motive but no means for carrying out the fraud, then the fraud cannot be accomplished. If there is motive and means but no opportunity to commit the fraud, then the fraud cannot be carried out, and so on. And so this is just a way of thinking about what has to be in place, or what has to exist, both motive, or to include motive, opportunity, and means for fraud to happen. And then we look at the traditional types of fraud, and those include corruption, misapplication or misappropriation of assets. So it would be things like, that could be stealing of cash, or diverting funds to some unintended purpose, or fraudulent financial reporting, which is one of the big purposes of our year-end audits, are not to detect fraud, but to at least provide a level of comfort that the statements fairly represent, in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles, the results of operations. And if during that audit an auditor becomes aware of fraud or suspected fraud, there are certain steps that have to be taken. And so, again, when we think about fraud, we can think of it in terms of corruption or just dishonesty. We can think about it in terms of misappropriation of assets, that is literally stealing or diverting assets from their intended purpose, or we think about it in terms of fraudulent financial reporting. And so one of the drivers of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002 were the scandals, the Enron scandal and the MCI scandal. That really shook public confidence in the accounting process, or in the public accounting firms, because they essentially became complicit in some of the fraud that happened. Particularly, you may recall Arthur Andersen, and it's the Enron scandal that really was the beginning of the downfall of Arthur Andersen. And so, and there were huge amounts of money lost, both employee 401k holdings and employee stock holdings and stock market holdings, and there were just huge amounts of money lost in this. And the public outcry and pressure from that is what really caused this Sarbanes-Oxley Act to be passed. And we have different sections inherent to that law that hold management of companies responsible for the any kind of fraud that may take place. So we have Section 404, which is the Management Assessment of Internal Controls, and that says that management must attest to the adequacy and operating effectiveness of internal controls. So they must sign a letter to the auditors that speak to the internal controls of the company. Section 302, which is the corporate responsibility for a financial report, requires that the Chief Executive Officer and Chief Financial Officer certify in the annual or quarterly report that the signing officer reviewed the report and that the report does not contain any untrue or omission of material fact that make the statements misleading. So, the point of these sections of the law is that they establish accountability and responsibility for reporting of results of operations and how those amounts are collected, and the processes and procedures around the operations. It holds those executives directly responsible for that, which was a big change up until that point with respect to how, before then, there wasn't that level of accountability. And so there are then also, as Sarbanes-Oxley, there's this section 806, which says protection for employees of publicly traded companies who provide evidence of fraud, and that's known as the whistleblower protection. So, employees who see fraud and who report fraud, this section of the law prohibits the companies from retaliating against these employees. And then section 906, the corporate responsibility for financial reporting, also provides that corporate management must certify reports filed with the Securities and Exchange Commission, and it also provides for criminal penalties of where these certifications have proven later to be wrong. So there are a lot more levels of accountability and a lot more disciplinary actions that can be taken against the management of companies with the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. And so you'll find often that in the design of accounting information systems, highly ethical and high integrity in your senior management really causes them to be very interested in how the system is designed to facilitate the execution of all these sections. And so more and more auditors are expected to understand how IT affects the audit. So instead of relying on IT consultants to conduct the IT audit. And here we have the different types of audits. And we have audits over internal controls. So, for publicly traded companies now, the auditors have to issue an opinion on the adequacy of the internal controls surrounding the financial reporting. There are the audits of the financial statements. There's IT audits, so that many companies will engage their public accounting firms to audit their IT processes. And then there's this idea of an integrated audit, which integrates the audit of internal control with the audit of financial statements. And so, in knowing that there are these audits and knowing that there are internal controls that have to be followed, we want to understand what the impact of all of that is on the design of the accounting system. And in general, what that does is to increase the level of transparency required of the accounting system. So we also, when we talk about financial reporting, we have this idea of preventative versus detective controls. So a preventative control is exactly what it says. It is a control that's intended to prevent errors or fraud that could result in misstatement of the financial statements. Detective controls are controls that are executed in order to help detect or identify errors or fraud that have occurred that could result in the misstatement of financial statements. So when we're designing an accounting system, we have to be aware of what preventative and detective controls are inherent to our internal control policies and procedures, and ensure that the accounting system is compliant with those controls or those control features. And then we talk about this idea of internal control deficiencies. We have this idea of a material weakness, and that's the deficiency such that there's a reasonable possibility that a material misstatement of financial statements will not be prevented or detected on a timely basis. And then we have this idea of a significant deficiency, which is less severe than a material weakness, but still merits attention of those responsible for oversight of financial reporting. And so, we again want to, we'll talk and have talked through the semester about this idea of cost-benefit trade-offs. We need to understand that we have these different levels of error, right, or omissions that can occur, and that, in keeping with this idea of cost-benefit trade-off, we want to make sure that our system can support the difference between significant deficiencies and material weaknesses with respect to our internal controls where necessary. And so here we're talking about, so what is internal control? And again, we've already talked about this idea that it's a key element of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, that it's a system of controls required by Sarbanes-Oxley, and it's the policies, internal controls are the policies, they are the procedures, they are the activities to achieve an organization's objective, and they are related to reporting efficient and effective operations, to getting to an end result of reliable financial reporting. They are inherent to the safeguarding of assets, and they are necessary in order to ensure compliance with applicable laws and regulations. So for internal control to be effective, an organization needs both stated policies and procedures and then compliance with internal controls. And you recall earlier we discussed that according to Sarbanes-Oxley, it is management's responsibility, not the auditors and not the designers of the accounting information system, but it is management's responsibility to ensure that internal controls are adequately designed to achieve their intended purpose and that they're implemented and executed in order to achieve their intended purpose. And so, we need to, as designers of the system, understand what controls are and what controls are in place and how they're inherent to the processes and how that impacts the accounting information system. But it is management's responsibility to ensure that these controls are designed correctly and implemented and executed as intended. And then we have these 5 elements or 5 categories of internal control. And this is really the, when we think about an internal control framework, we think about the idea that we have a control environment. And so that's the environment set by top management. And sometimes that's referred to as tone at the top. We have this idea of risk assessment, and that's that management is constantly assessing the operating environment in which it conducts business and ensuring that the controls that are established are sufficient to address the risk associated with that environment. We have this idea that information and communication systems are relevant to the financial reporting and are working as intended. We have these control activities, which are really the operating controls of the company and that they're being followed. And we have this monitoring of controls, and that's the monitoring of the execution of these control activities to ensure that they are being executed on an ongoing basis. And so we have this idea that these 5 categories are what makes up the internal control component of an organization. And so what we talk about here, one way to think about this is that when we think about IT controls is that we can break these down into 3 different levels. And in our text refers to it as a house of internal controls. We have a top management level, we have a business process or application level, and then we have the IT support, IT services level that includes the general controls. And so if we look at it from this perspective, the top management level are the entity level controls. These controls affect the enterprise's overall control environment. And there we talk again about this idea that it's the tone at the top, and that's set by these organizations we see here in the top management level as the board of directors, the chief executive officer, the chief financial officer, the chief information officer, and the chief security officer. And so, it's we think about this, that they are the ones who send the signal to the rest of the organization about how important controls are or are not. Then we talk about application controls, and those are the controls that are embedded within a business process application, such as the accounting system, right? So applications are designed with controls to prevent or detect unauthorized transactions. And the application control objectives for financial reporting include completeness, accuracy, authorization, and existence of transactions. And we often refer to these elements as management assertions. Right. So we have application controls which are embedded in these business processes. And we've looked at all of these business processes before, if you recall, our baseline model. Right. And then we have the support to all of these business processes that filters up to top management, and that's the IT services level. And so those are that is the level at which our networks, our database, our system hardware, telecommunications, and our operating systems are supported. And the controls within that level are general controls. And so they include controls around program development. So do we have controls that track versions of program development? Do we have reviews that ensure that program development that there are no fraudulent or misappropriation of assets being conducted as a result of programming into these business applications? Do we have access controls, right? So do we have password protection, and it requires certain levels of passwords, and it requires that they be changed every so often. And so you can see that these are the ideas around general controls. So again, we think about entity level, application, and general controls from an IT perspective. And so each transaction cycle can be expanded to show the transactions in each cycle and the application control objectives. Here, the application control objectives are shown for processing purchases, processing accounts payable, and paying bills. And these are just some examples of the application level controls inherent to the business processes, and in this case, it's the purchasing cycle business process. And that includes processing purchases, right? So we want to record authorized purchase orders completely and accurately, right? So what we have inherent to that step is that purchase orders are reviewed and approved by the appropriate level of management. We want to, under the process accounts payable, we want to safeguard accounts payable records, right? So we want to ensure that our record-keeping retention policies are appropriate and compliant. And so these are some examples of application level controls to purchasing cycle. Here we see some examples of the application controls for the sales cycle. Here are a few examples of the application controls for the payroll cycle. And a few more examples of application controls for the banking cash application cycle. And this one becomes very important because cash, because it is such a liquid asset, is highly susceptible to misappropriation or theft. And so this is an area where we spend a lot of time as accounting information system specialists in ensuring that controls around this processing of cash are appropriate and for the level of coverage that the organization desires. And we have controls here for the financial reporting cycle, or I'm sorry, for the financial cycle. So, once we've gotten through these other business cycles, how do we record those cycles, the results of those cycles in our general ledger? And these are the controls related to that step, or examples of controls. And again, there's no one absolute right or wrong control. These are all a function of the business processes as implemented at various organizations. So you're not going to find a list of absolute must-have controls. Our best bet is to understand the different types of controls for different business functions, and then judgmentally we have to make decisions when we're designing the system as to what we recommend. And then finally, we have controls that are applicable to the reporting objective, and so those deal with the issuing our financial statements and perhaps other management reports. And so we have, as you can imagine, and I'm sure you all have seen in the business publications, that there's a dramatic growth in outsourcing of services, which has come along with cloud computing services, which many organizations are using. The AICPA has issued a reporting framework for service organization control, or SOC reports, and there are 3 SOC reports that are simply identified as SOC1, SOC2, and SOC3. And so for SOC1 reports, They're issued by the service organization to report on its controls relevant to your company's internal control over financial reporting. And so what that means is that if you outsource your accounting function to a third-party outsourcer or a third-party service organization provider, they're going to have to issue a service organization control report if you're a publicly traded company. And so we would have a Type 1 report and we have a Type 2 report, and we see the differences between those two here. And so then we have SOC2 reports, which are issued by the service organization to report on controls other than those relevant to your internal controls related to financial reporting. So SOC1 reports report on controls at outsourced providers as they relate to financial reporting. SOC2 reports report on controls other than controls related to financial reporting. And again, we see that there are two types of those. And essentially the difference between these Type 1 and Type 2 reports is that Type 1 reports provide the opinion regarding the fairness of the service organization's description, but it doesn't test the controls and it doesn't express an opinion regarding the effectiveness. Type 2 reports reports on the same information as Type 1, but it also provides an opinion regarding the effectiveness of the controls. So it's it's a more valuable. The Type 2 report is a more valuable report to us as buyers of that service, but it also costs more, obviously. And then we have this idea of trust services that the AICPA has, and these you may have seen. There are web trust services and other different levels of trust services related to information systems that the AICPA has provided some guidance as to what is related to those or included in those trust services. And this gives us the 5 principles that the trust services are based on, such as security, availability, processing integrity, confidentiality, and privacy. And then these are the 5 principles for managing fraud risk, right? So principle 1 is fraud risk governance. And so that says that there should be a written policy which reflects the expectations of the board of directors and top management regarding managing fraud risk. Then we have fraud risk. So that says, well, it's important to the board of directors and to our governance of this organization that we manage fraud risk. We understand it could exist, and we acknowledge that there's something we have to do about it. Principle 2 is fraud risk assessment, and that says that, well, so the organization routinely assesses, right, the potential for risk, right, and then executes actions in order to mitigate that risk as appropriate. Principle 3 is fraud prevention, and that says that, well, there are these techniques that have been established to avoid fraud, and then when it can't be avoided, there are other techniques that have been deployed which mitigate the impact on the organization. And then we have principle 4 is fraud detection, which really says, hey, we put in place these techniques, these policies, these procedures to uncover fraud when we're not able to prevent it to begin with. And then there's principle 5 that says fraud investigation and corrective action. That says, well, if we're not able to prevent it and we do detect it, then we will investigate and there will be a corrective action that is both timely and appropriate for the level of fraud. And so this becomes important, right, that we, in managing the risk of fraud, right, and in order to show that we have a good internal control environment, we have these 5 principles that guide how we approach this. This again becomes a model for how do we address the risk of fraud in an organization. And again, it's incumbent on us as designers of accounting information systems to understand these principles, because they do impact how we design the accounting system and some of the steps, policies, and procedures that are necessary in order to illustrate that we do have a strong internal control environment in the accounting information systems. And so this concludes the discussion of Chapter 10. It's an important chapter, and I would suggest that you go back and read it very closely, because the idea of fraud and control is very important, or fraud and internal control is very important in the accounting field now. And again, it's kind of more important from our perspective, because for a lot of IT folks, they don't grasp these concepts, and they aren't, they have different, they just have different other priorities. And so it's important for us to understand this and to be able to bring this to the table for conversation. So please go back and read the chapter, and I look forward to talking with you about our next topic. And thank you.